so that the critics are not involved in anatomizing the artist rather than critiquing the work of art. So if you are to critique a work of art, what do you do? So you take the work as for stylistic analysis, where everything is objectively seen, formalist analysis, analysis of imagery, analysis of symbology, analysis of the structural pattern, schemes. So all these analysis, according to T.S. Eliot, should be objective, based only on the poet. Now think about the content that is not written in the poem, the content that is in between the lines. In the postmodernist age, we have new definition of criticism. For example, Dominic Head, in his famous modernist short story, talks about the act of reading a short story. He says that reading a short story is like the filling in gaps in between the narrative hints. So narrative hints are provided by the writer, and the task of the reader is to fill in the gap in between the narrative hints, thereby making the critic or a reader a partial author of the text. Now, T.S. Eliot is not talking about this. Now, if poetry too is, as he has talked about the wasteland, some good passages and some bad passages jumbled together, fragmented lines are put together in a kind of collage. So there must be something written, something must be unwritten by the poet. There must have been a conscious choice that the poet has made in a selection of words, in a selection of rhythm. And the choice should be critiqued from the critical perspective. And when we have a critical thinking applied to this text, of course, we have to read what is not written in the text. If the author is dead, author is outside the text, and the reader has the full independence to see what is there in the text, irrespective of what the author has intended to in the text, the reader has always the right to see the structure of emotion, the set of object, and to analyze the text objectively, according to T.S. Eliot. And that, he says, will be honest criticism. So if we read the phrase honest criticism that he has used in Tradition and Individual Talent with reference to dishonest criticism. So what will be dishonest criticism according to Eliot? Is to look at the poet, the artist, and to see faults in the work of art by taking into account the artist's life, personal life, and the personality of the artist, to analyze the personality of the work of art. So this is a dishonest criticism. That means the poet should not be a liar. You remember long ago, Plato said that poetry is the act of lying. Poetry is written by poets who are actually liars, who rob the courageous of courage and simply make falsified images represent a falsification of the real world. The absolute, the ideal, all these are missing in the works of the poet. So everything that is created by the poet is simply an imitation of an illusory world, an imitation of a world that is like a shadow. So if a poet is trying to represent that world, maintaining objectivity, maintaining scientific precision, we can come to this Platonic view of the impossibility of art. Impossibility of art. Art is not possible. Aristotle said that art is possible, art is there, and we must define, classify, categorize art, and then we must go on to theorize art, because art is there. He classifies poetry into the narrative and the dramatic poetry, and further classifies the dramatic poetry into tragedy and comedy, the narrative poetry into longer epic and shorter lyric, ode. So such definition of narrative and the dramatic in Aristotle also moves towards the formulation of the form of literature. But as far as content of literature is concerned, we again have different types of theories. One say that literature is a mirror to society. One theory says that no, it is like a lamp, illumination is done by the poet inside the text. And therefore, T.S. Eliot is not talking about the illumination of the poet through the work of art, rather a kind of illumination in the poet, in the poem, by the poet, by holding a mirror to society. So he is trying to reconcile the Platonic with the Aristotelian, the concept of the spirit with the concept of matter, the concept of the content with the concept of the form. While for Plato, content, once converted into form, makes the content dead. I repeat, content, when it is formulated into form, that marks the end of the content. Say if you define love. Once you define love, the idea of love is dead. Once you define something, objectively, if you define something, once you have made the definition, thing become fixed and dead, according to Plato. Therefore, the absolute, the ideal concept of love cannot be attained if you start writing love. So for Plato, it is better not to write love, because whatever you write about love will become a falsification of love, because that will not be an absolute concept of love. That will not be an ideal. Now T.S. Eliot is talking about objectivity in art. How is that possible? T.S. Eliot's Prufrock will travel through this metropolitan location and sing the song. Always remember, there is a song at the top of J. Alfred Prufrock, and this is not a poem. This is a song, a love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. If we go through this song of love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, we find that yes, it is a song. It might be as a swan song, it might be the love song, but song is there. From the beginning to the end, we have the song in the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. Why the love song? It can be a love song. Why the love song? See, objectivity is now replaced by universality. So T.S. Eliot is thinking about the love song, end of everything, end of the song, love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. The entire Petrarchan concept of love song is inverted. Therefore, this is a poetry working on inversion. Everything is challenged. It is anti-Petrarchan in concept. So anti-Petrarchan Shakespeare was, my mistress's eyes are nothing like the sun. Coral is far more red than her lips is red. Shakespeare was also anti-Petrarchan. But when we read William Shakespeare's sonnets, as William Wordsworth stated, that through these sonnets, Shakespeare unclasped to us his heart. This is what Wordsworth said about Shakespeare's sonnets. In short, that Shakespeare's sonnets are autobiographical pieces where the subjectivity of the poet got fully expressed. T.S. Eliot is defending William Shakespeare and saying that had Shakespeare done so, lesser artist is he. Meaning that Shakespeare has never exposed his heart through his sonnets. But when we analyze Shakespeare's sonnets, we find that the voice of Shakespeare dominates. Alongside the voice of, say, Mr. W.H. or, say, the Dark Lady, we have the three voices coming together in the sonnets of Shakespeare. And these three voices, according to Jan Kott, are dramatic voices. Three characters independently existing in the works. Now, one voice is that of W.S. or William Shakespeare. Do we say that this is an expression of emotion? William Wordsworth says, yes, this is a subjective expression of Shakespeare's personal life. So, in between the time that he got from his active dramatic activities, the little time he got, he penned down his personal poems and unclaps to us the secrets of his soul, secrets of his heart. These are personal poems. So when he will write that, when to the sessions of sweet silent thought, I summon up remembrance of things past. I sigh the lack of many a things I sought. Wordsworth will say that this is William Shakespeare crying, expressing his emotional tranquility. And T.S. Eliot, on the other hand, says, no, Shakespeare is not a lesser artist. He is a greater artist because he has the ability to objectify his personal experience and, like a shred of platinum, work intellectually in order to represent that in terms of emotion, in terms of art. So Shakespeare will be writing, that time of year thou mayest in me behold, when yellow leaves or none, or few do hang upon thy boughs, which shake against the cold. Can you see Shakespeare in these lines? Shakespeare is invisible. Can you hear a voice in these lines? Yes, it is the voice of a person. Shakespeare was just 35 when he is writing this poem. And Shakespeare is using the voice of a man who, like a bare tree with a bare ruined choir, with a few leaves or none, appears to be dying on a sick bed. This is not Shakespeare. That means the emotion that has been transferred through a set of object has objective correlative according to T.S. Eliot. So in J. Alfred Prufrock, again we have this objective correlative, and this objective correlative is maintained by dramatizing the situation. This is not seen in the poems of, say, William Wordsworth. So the voice that we hear in William Wordsworth's poem is essentially the voice of the poet. So naturally, what happens when we have to analyze this poem of William Wordsworth, say, Immortality Ode or Tintern Abbey, we have to look into the biography of the poet. Even while analyzing Kubla Khan, we have to read the biography of the poet. But this is very dangerous. A poem that was composed in 1797, a poem that went through so many revisions before its publication in 1814, cannot give any kind of glimpse or hint about the personality of the poem, of the poet. Rather, it is the personality of Kubla Khan or the poet persona or the voices or even the damsel with a dulcimer playing on a dulcimer, singing of Mount Abora. All these are characters who are present. But we have Lime Tree Bower, My Prison Still, or Ode to Solitude, where we see, we hear the poet rather than the persona that the poet has created. What T.S. Eliot was saying is that there should be no kind of prejudice in the representation, in the imitation. And while holding the mirror, that mirror should be very objective, should be very transparent, should reflect on the reality without any kind of authorial intervention. This kind of theory of poetry comes very close to Aristotle's concept of mimesis. Yet there are differences in Eliot's practical view, practical representation. So he's using a series of tropes in order to represent, and such tropes are essentially represented in such a way that the poet has a feeling that such tropes should transmute the emotion in such a way that the readers take that as a systematic study of a typical person in a typical situation. Let us go then, you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky. So are these musical, song-like? Let us go then, you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky, like a patient it rise upon our table. Let us go then, you and I. Love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. It's a song. So this is not simply the vocabulary of ordinary conversation, rather an objective representation of a person, J. Alfred Prufrock, who is singing a song, walking on the streets of an urban location, a metropolitan location, maybe London, Paris, Harvard. Let us go through certain half deserted streets, the muttering retreats of restless nights in one night cheap hotel and sawdust restaurant with oyster shells. Streets that follow like tedious argument of insidious intent. So what will this lead? This will lead you, the readers, those who are listening to the poem, to lead you to an overwhelming question. Oh, do not ask, what is it? Oh, do not ask, what is it? Let us go and make our visit. T.S. Eliot therefore uses this love song in order to represent an urban setting where he is placing the character. Now, who is this I in this poem? Who is this I? Is he Prufrock talking to a person who will accompany this? Throughout the poem is basically a poem of loneliness. Companionlessness is the central state of being. A set of situation is there in the poem where we have an individual moving through the streets of an urban location, metropolitan location, London, and finally traveling to the beach, thinking of a peach. In the room, the women come and go, talking of Michelangelo. In the room, the women come and go, talking of Michelangelo. Who is listening to this voice? Is it the poet who is responding to this voice? So these women who are traveling, entering into the gallery, appreciating the portrait of Michelangelo, will not find this man, Prufrock, attractive with his lean and thin limbs, with his stature that is non Michelangelo like. Then we have the famous trope of the cat. The finale imagery is used, and this finale imagery describes the urban location, where we have the representation of the urban location. But who is representing this? Is it the poet, narrator, or Prufrock, his consciousness? So this urban space becomes the narrator of this poem, the consciousness that is there at the center of the poem. I think that this I, the word I, represents this metropolitan location. The street, the houses, the gutters, the sawdust restaurants, all these create I. So, as a traveler who is moving through the streets of London, this traveler gets the companionship of the street. So, the street is there always with the narrator. And finally, when he stands on the beach, the street vanishes. Like a patient etherized on a table, upon a table, what does it mean? So, evening is now late. Extreme form of personification. So, who is visioning or who is seeing this image, representing this image? So, poetic creativity does not depend on the subjective overflow of powerful thoughts, powerful feeling, powerful emotion, but rather an artistic manipulation of that in particular metrical form with the help of schematized patterning of language and tropes. J. Alfred Prufrock is a schematized poem, highly structured artifice, artificial poem containing the urban stories. Multiple stories are there in J. Alfred Prufrock and presented in a very dramatic manner with the help of the device of dramatic monologue. And that device of dramatic monologue becomes very effective when we have the voices. And indeed, there will be time to wonder, do I dare? Do I dare? Time to turn back and descend the stair with a bald spot in the middle of my hair. Think of this man who is thinking of proposing a girl, a woman. He has already become middle aged with a bald spot on his head, thin limbs, putting on the middle class suit with a necktie. And indeed, there will be time to wonder, do I dare? Do I dare? Time to turn back and descend the stair with a bald spot in the middle of my hair. They will say, how his hair is growing thin. My morning coat, my collar, mounting firmly to the chin. My necktie rich and modest, but asserted by a simple pin. They will say, but how his arms and legs are thin. Do I dare disturb the universe? In a minute, there is a time for decisions and revisions, which in a minute will reverse. For I have known them all, have known the evenings, mornings, afternoons. I have measured out my life with coffee spoons. I have measured out my life with coffee spoons. So, this particular line, I think, describes Eliot's theory of poetry, his concept of objective correlative, his concept of impersonal theory of poetry, his concept of poet's mind as a shade of platinum, capable of converting thought into poetry, emotion, feeling, intellect, thought blended together into poetry. Therefore, now I just proceed with this observation to draw a conclusion on T.S. Eliot's work, saying that T.S. Eliot theory of poetry is essentially based on tradition, Aristotelian tradition. In the structuralist definition of poetry, formalist tradition of poetry, he is introducing a newer view of poetry that is more objective, based on the works of Russian formalists and the English formalists, and trying to derive a theory of poetry that comes very close to the scientific view. But again, this modernist way of looking at poetry that keeps on adding to the structures will formulate a kind of structure, a formula that will definitely will also be attacked by the post-structuralist critics and writers, thinkers. Therefore, T.S. Eliot will become much a center of the criticism, especially for his poetic theory, especially the psychoanalyst writers, critics. For example, Harold Bloom criticizes Aristotle's Eliot's theory of poetry on the basis of his theory of anxiety of influence. He says that T.S. Eliot's poetry, working under the same anxiety of influence, is writing a kind of misreading of poetry. And he says that so many texts do enter in Shakespeare, in T.S. Eliot's work, mainly drawn from the works of Shakespeare, Webster, John Donne, and take some type of unformed, unorganized shape in T.S. Eliot's work. Similarly, Marxist literary criticism considered T.S. Eliot's theory to be more elitist. Okay, more based on the artistic refinements in poetry and structuration. They criticized T.S. Eliot for not responding to the rhythms of the time and unable to represent in an objective manner the values, the working class values in literature. Therefore, T.S. Eliot has been condemned as a theoretician who is bourgeois, petty bourgeois in reform, and capable of using an elitist view of Anglo-Catholic concept of poetry. Similarly, feminist critics, they also talk a lot about T.S. Eliot and say that in the works of T.S. Eliot, especially the theory of poetry, there is a formal representation of the poetic form, theoretical representation of poetic form, without its close association with the contextual alternatives. The voice of the female, that is unheard in the poems of T.S. Eliot. Therefore, the form itself is the poetical form of T.S. Eliot, however modernist, is not accommodative, does not have any space for the female voice. And finally, we have the comments by the critics, mainly post-colonial critics, who condemn T.S. Eliot to be more Eurocentric in his concept of poetry, while accepting or acknowledging the influence of the margins and the peripheries, the non-Western cultures, in the formation of the metropolitan culture or the modernist, Western modernist culture of art.